So thank you, Michael. I'm glad to be here today. John Ward this morning mentioned about the Ontario scene and the way in which we've always paired individualized funding with independent facilitation as one of the support to act that Tim mentioned. And so we have a long history in Ontario of building the capacity, the viability of independent facilitation and planning so that individuals and their families, their loved ones can be helped to reimagine, rethink, and build places for change, build context for change, and build relationships that matter so that people can change and feel the support as they change. And so independent facilitators within our organization for the last 15.5 years have been privileged to stand alongside people as they change and to be and bear witness to the kind of change that has a careful weaving of those people in their lives within the context of their lives. So as people change, so do the people that they love most and who have stood by them over time also change. So I'll talk a bit about the reciprocity of change and what that means for individuals and what does that mean for our role. Because certainly if you think about your own lives, change happens through and by and with those you love, those who have your back, and those who have stood by you over time. And held your story in a special, particular way as it evolved, as it shifted, as it reverted, as it moved forward, all the ways in which our stories transform. So I'm going to begin with a quote, something I wrote about how I perceive what I witnessed as an independent facilitator over the last 21 years. As story beings, we need to carefully construct a new story about ourselves over time in such a way that we feel transformed from the inside out so that we can own our new story. And this question about whose story is it anyways, who tells our stories, and which part of the story are we willing to tell over time, and what does it take to be supported to actually understand, work through, dissect, and own one's story. So just to say a little bit more about Families for a Secure Future, in the introduction he spoke about Families for a Secure Future having two real forces for change. One is that we enter into relationship with an individual, their family, their loved ones, their supporters, whomever that might be, a broad definition of family, those who have made a commitment over time to an individual. And we both support the individual to gather people, to begin to explore and think differently, maybe reimagine what their life could be, and even imagine and give words to articulate what is my story right here, right now. And so the support that we do is pretty intense. The relationship develops over time. We've been supporting families now for 14 years, many of them, and we've had very committed family groups for over 14 years as well, who meet monthly and who commit themselves to grow and learn together over time. And we did this sort of double, perceiving it from the outset as two forces for change, because we realized, and I particularly realized that for 8 years I was a senior advisor in Ontario for People First movement, and I witnessed over and over again the way in which people met the necessity for change and met the conditions for change. And change is as unique as, for each of us, as you can imagine. And it isn't just through independent facilitators that bring about change. I'd like to talk a little bit about that. You know what has transformed your life. It could have been a question. It could have been being pushed to the point where change was the only option. And in the People First movement, I saw both. And I considered, and I began to consider that people tell stories. People First movement is a story movement, and they tell story. They begin to find what's true between all of us, what are our lived experiences, where the shared stories, and very often those stories are stories of pain and stories of oppression, stories of otherness. And I became interested in how do we support people to move their story along, to transform and restory their lives that has a little bit more possibility. And yet what I found is that it happens anyways. So there is something about people hearing, being ready for, having the conditions for change, and so that became a real question for me. What are the conditions for change that ripens us towards change? What is this ripening activity? Because I believe we ripen into change. And so in Families for a Secure Future, we felt that change is interactive, and if families hold out hope for their sons and daughters' lives to change, they need to be in that process of change as well. So in the family groups, we have conversations that are inspiring, emboldening, and that model change over and over on a regular routine, so that people were there when you were not prepared to even consider him moving in. And now I see the transformation in the questions you're asking, the possibilities you're imagining, the impact your son's wish or longing is having on you. So again, we see change happening in a very synergistic way, and we want to be present to both of those. Families need safe places they can fall back into to tell their story, to speak their vision and their fears, their worries. They're wondering about how will my son's life change if there aren't forces of change acting upon us, which is often the future, but forces of change and supports for that change. And we all know that change is not easy, it's grueling, and for change to have that kind of impact where it is sustained over time, it needs to be intentional. There are changes that happen in our lives that happen merely out of a responding reactant frame. And so how can we create conscious changes that actually follow the direction, the trajectory of our aspirations and what we really wish for or couldn't imagine previously? I had a woman once that said, she was a mentor of mine, and she kept saying, you just brought that dream into being for me. And just a little question that I might ask her, I just dreamt a dream I would never have dreamt without that question. So sometimes a provocative question can be the catalyst for asking different questions of yourself and even considering different ways that you might consider what's in front of you. So at this point in this movement, it's very exciting to be here and hear about it conceived of as a movement. We've begun to think that independent facilitators and planners may have a role to play as catalysts for change. And I hear often that we're agents for change. And I think we're lost if we believe that about ourselves and our role, because as Michael Kendrick said, people have been changing for eons. And so we know it's true that we will find a way to change anyways. And so I would like to characterize that one of the ways in which we can be supportive as independent facilitators is first to develop relationship and an abiding relationship. One that is signaling something quite different than the kinds of relationships one is to hope for in services, in the service system. An abiding relationship where trust is built over time, and the relationship begins to be an explorative one that where each is exploring what this concept of what I'll call reciprocity of change can mean, and what it does mean as we change together. So what I discovered, what I observed through the People First movement in the last few years in Families for a Secure Future, is that there is a reciprocity of change. So as you change, I also change. And for change to be sustainable, it needs to arise out of a trusting relationship, an abiding relationship, where as I discover more about myself, you also discover more about yourself. As I discover the consequences of some of my longings, some of the possibilities I'm considering, you also bear and think through the consequences of those possibilities. So the thing that I guess I experimented with over the 8 years in People First is when I saw transformative change, I would say, and what made that possible? And people over and over and over again said, Justin believed in me, or Georgia said I could do it. And I discovered that you don't need a choir of people to tell another story about yourself, to help you re-story, reimagine, that one abiding connection that will help spur a different perception that I can hold of myself and others may hold of me can be a game changer. And I think part of our responsibility in helping people as they walk into change and they walk into the uncertainty and the questions in the future that are questions that your future comes towards you. So as people are walking into the necessity for change or the desire for change, it's the question of who is holding my story and watching it unfold over time alongside me. And who has my back, willing to pick me up when I fall. And that's not to say that that is what the independent facilitator does. But in our role and as we establish an abiding, trusting relationship, we're forming a bigger and larger team or allyship, or those that would believe in you. So one of the things that we do, I think that's essential, is having a particular way of listening and a particular stance towards what is it I'm listening with you for. And when people start telling me their story, I presume that this is not the first time they have told their story, although sometimes if their story has been taken over by their family members, and as a sibling I can say that early on my mother had taken over my brother's story, and it went something like this. Oh my God, he'll never work, he can't sit long enough, he can't walk long enough, and he can't manage long enough. So his leading narrative, the story that the box that she had painted for him, well, really overwhelmed me as a sibling. But for him, it was like, okay, I get it. And then he'd come to me with sidebar conversations that she says, I'm never going to work. Why would I go to college then, Judith? I don't understand. I can't walk long enough. I can't sit long enough. What is it? Walk, sit, and there were 3 shouldn't, couldn't, wouldn't statements in his leading narrative. And it was very difficult both to witness that negative story, but also to understand what it meant for him to hear that story over and over again, what it meant to him to bring me off to the side and start asking for, wishing for another narrative, another story, and what it meant for my mother to have to tell that story over and over again because she was too frightened to imagine better. So complacency often comes from a terror or a fear of imagining better. So facilitators both presume that everyone has an rich inner life. I do believe that everyone has worked through plans, and my job or our job is to try to surface and reveal what it is people have been thinking about what's next, about how they'll manage. And so there are many, many stories within a story. Even if it's unspoken, even if they're nonverbal, there is an inner picture of what will happen to me when my parents are long gone. What will happen to me when I graduate? I'm fascinated by these inner narratives people have, even though often those around them have not yet unveiled them, unearthed them, and tried to understand them. It reminds me of a story where years ago, I was with a family over time, and we were in conversations over time about what happens with your 89-year-old mom. I'd say, well, what do you think happens? And we had brought together two siblings, a sister-in-law, the individual who was living with his 89-year-old mom. And one of the things that made her extremely nervous, and I can remember to this day, she would have this high-pitched giggle whenever the son would say, "Mom, what are you going to do? I mean, what happens if something happens to you? And he's the only one here, and what's going to happen? What's going to happen?" And she would just go, I can imagine, I can imagine. And I thought, it's so indicative. I'll bet your son has a plan. So finally, I turned to him and said, "Tell me this, when you get up in the morning, where do you go?" He said, "I go to breakfast, and I'll try to," he would speak like this, I go in the kitchen, I'll go in the toast." And I said, "Right, so you're going to get toast in the morning. What if your mom's not there? Is she usually there?" "Oh yeah, Judith, she's there." And I said, "What if she's not there? What would you do?" And his brother's going, asking him what he's going to do. Oh my God. Room. Yeah. And I said, "Well, what do you do?" And he said, I call her name. So, Mom. And I said, "What do you do if she doesn't respond?" He goes, "I go up, I check her. And I said, "Okay, she still doesn't respond, what are you going to do?" He said, "I'm clear. I put it over my shoulder, I take her next door, I knock on the door, see if they'll come." He had a plan. And his brother, to this day, was amazed that there was a plan in place. It hadn't been revealed. And he probably would have acted. And the reason he said that, he said, "I'm man of the house, I'm man of the house." So he had taken seriously the role that he's living with an aging mom. And while we were going through these conversations, the story was she was in full health, and we ought not to have this conversation, Judith. And yet, 3 months later, she found out that she was full of cancer, they couldn't operate, and she died within 5 months of that story. And that sort of unearthing what are the possibilities. And then we developed with him a plan of if he were to wake up in the morning and she couldn't be roused and perhaps real ill, we came up with a system of how he would call 911, and we made an agreement with the 911 service about having him be there when emergency staff would come and hand her purse over all the information. So I do believe that we need to listen to the understory, what is being said, what's not being said, how are the possibilities arising for thinking about managing the future, coping, negotiating the future, and understanding that there is stories to the contrary, that we need to help people expand upon roles that have had significance in people's lives, roles that can be extended, expanded, and that have meaning, and that walk people into relationships. And so support circles, both deepening relationships and connection, support circles for helping people have a place to consider, experiment, and practice with voice, change, and thinking differently about how people perceive them. Because if you can't transform the picture you have inwardly of who you are, you can't possibly take on change. Change does not come from the outside in, except through really difficult circumstances where change is the only option. It's a necessity. I've been given the... Have I got more time, Michael? Okay. So I would say I don't believe in the no plan plan. We got started 15.5 years ago, being invited in from agencies saying that what we think is that the aging families have a no plan plan, which means that they believe somebody, their son or daughter, if they were to die, would be taken into service. And I do believe that we need to try to figure out, without articulating a plan, what's the plan? Because there will be a plan, and if you're a sibling, you know quite well that the no plan plan probably means you. And a sibling who spoke to me today about the no plan plan had major consequences for her. And so who defines the pace of change? the nature and direction of change, and who defines who and what kinds of support will be alongside you as you experiment, play with, explore the possibilities in your life. And I believe that support circles do that well, but if there's not a support circle, an expanded group, one of the things I'm always listening for is who's backed you, who believes in you, who's been your champion, and listening for and helping the person perceive, acknowledge, and understand that beyond the thought that the mother and the father are the only ones that are taking a stance for change, that there are others that gladly bear witness to what happens once a picture is formed. And finally, one last thing I would like to say, a whole section that I want to say, is that I do believe that peoples have a longing for, we all do, it's universally a need, and that is to have moments and parts of our lives that are marked, signaling initiation, signaling from this to this. And so in our planning work, we make opportunities, formal day-long opportunities for storying people's lives, hearing stories from 20 people, 25 people, and then making sense of the story, because it's so hard to believe that these is the list of your gifts and strengths without evidencing them, hearing from those stories. It's clear that I'm pretty talented in this house. I am what brings us together. So when a story is told and the gifts and talents, strengths and resiliences are brought out of those stories, people leave changed because they have been restoried. They now understand what their life, what meaning their life has had, and how others have been grateful for, what they bring to the world.